The salt spray hits your face as you are dragged toward the long ship. You stumble, your feet scraping against the wet sand, the sound of fire crackling behind you. You are 17, the daughter of a coastal village in Ireland. For you, the world has just ended. The men who now own you shout in a language you cannot understand. Their voices harsh, their laughter sharp like blades. Smoke burns your eyes, the air thick with the scent of ash and fear. Around you, the cries of your people fade beneath the roar of the waves. Your wrists bleed where the ropes cut into them. You look back once more, but there is nothing left to see. Only flames devouring everything you knew. You are no longer someone's daughter or sister or friend. You are a captive, a possession, and your journey into the heart of a terrifying new reality has just begun. We often remember the Vikings for their courage, their ships, and their thirst for exploration. We picture fearless warriors crossing endless seas, discovering new worlds, and leaving behind great legends. But behind that image lies another truth, darker, colder, and far more real. For every hero sung about in the sagas, there were countless voices that never made it into their stories. Voices like yours, lost in chains, carried away by the tide of conquest. The Viking world was not built only on bravery and adventure. It was built on suffering, a system where human lives were traded like silver. If we forget this truth, we risk misunderstanding what truly made that age so powerful and so cruel. The Viking raid was not chaos or random violence. It was a system planned and precise. Every raid was a business, a dark trade with human lives as the prize. Chieftains and warriors did not sail only for gold or glory, they sailed for people. Villages, monasteries, and towns were their targets, not only for wealth but for the living bodies they could sell. The long ships that sliced through waves were not just tools of war, but ships of commerce. They were built with a purpose, to move swiftly, strike suddenly, and carry away captives before anyone could stop them. Each expedition required investment, wood for ships, iron for rivets, cloth for sails, and food for men. It was expensive, and those who funded it wanted profit. And the most valuable, most portable, and most reliable form of profit was not gold or silver. It was human flesh. The Vikings knew this well. Their ships, with shallow bottoms and flexible hulls, could travel from open seas into small rivers. No village was safe, no monastery too far inland. The enemy came silently, appearing like a storm. And when the storm passed, nothing was left but fire and silence. This is the truth behind the legend. The Viking raids were not only about courage or discovery, but about control and commerce. It was a system where human suffering was turned into wealth, and where each burning village was another transaction. The same ships that carried warriors to fame carried countless men and women into chains. This is the part the sagas never told, that beneath the stories of adventure and conquest was an empire built on the trade of stolen lives. The captives were bound together, their wrists tied with rough ropes that cut deep into the skin. The air was heavy with smoke and the scent of burned thatch. Behind them, their homes were nothing but ashes. Ahead, the long ships waited like dark beasts in the surf. The Vikings shouted orders, pushing the prisoners forward with the butts of their spears. Every stumble was met with laughter or a blow. The sea wind stung their eyes, carrying with it the cries of those left behind. There was no mercy, no understanding, only the knowledge that their old lives had ended. When they reached the ships, the captives were forced to climb aboard. The decks were slick with seawater and filth. They were packed tightly together, shoulder to shoulder, with no space to move. The ships were open to the sky, exposed to the cold winds of the North Atlantic. Waves crashed over the sides, drenching everyone in salt and ice. The journey could last for days or weeks, depending on where they were taken. Across the Irish Sea to Dublin, up the rivers of Britain, or north toward the fjords of Norway. The weak were not expected to survive. Those who fell ill were left to die where they lay. The smell was unbearable: sweat, blood, sickness, and salt. The creak of the oars and the groan of the wood mixed with the moans of the prisoners. Many closed their eyes and prayed, but their gods could not reach them here. The Viking warriors laughed, drank, and sang as the captives trembled in silence. For the women and children, each wave brought them farther from home and deeper into despair. The horizon was endless, the cold unrelenting, and the future unknown. By the time the ships reached their destination, they were no longer villagers or daughters or wives. They were cargo, human goods to be traded in a foreign land. The captives were dragged from their burning villages, their hands tied, their feet stumbling over stones and mud. Some tried to look back, but the smoke had swallowed their homes. The smell of fire clung to their hair, the cries of the wounded echoing behind them. The Vikings shouted commands in a harsh tongue that none could understand. Each word was sharp and cold like the edge of a blade. They marched for miles through wet fields and dark forests, beaten if they slowed. For the captives, every step carried them farther from the world they knew. When they reached the shore, the longships waited like monsters of wood and iron. The prisoners were pushed aboard, forced to sit close together, their backs against the curved hull. The ships were narrow, built for speed, not comfort. The sea was merciless when waves rose like walls crashing over them, soaking their clothes, chilling them to the bone. The air was filled with the smell of salt, vomit, and sweat. Food was scarce, water was rationed, and sickness spread quickly. Some prayed for the storm to end, others prayed for death. The journey crossed the wild Irish Sea, the gray waters of the North Atlantic, and the winding rivers that reached deep into the lands of Britain and Scandinavia. The Vikings navigated these routes with skill, their ships gliding silently into river mouths and narrow inlets. The captives, chained and starving, could only watch as forests and mountains passed by like ghosts. For many, this voyage was the border between life and oblivion. When the ships finally reached land, those who survived were not the same. Their bodies were weak, their spirits broken. And ahead of them lay the markets, places where their worth would be measured not by who they were, but by how much they could be sold for. When the longships reached the shore, the journey was not over. It was only the beginning of another kind of horror. The captives were taken to markets where human lives were sold like cattle. Dublin, known to the Norse as Dyflin, became one of the largest slave hubs in Western Europe. It was filled with noise, the clatter of chains, the shouts of traders, and the cries of those being separated from their families. Here Irish captives stood beside Britons, Franks, and Slavs. They were lined up, inspected, and priced. A strong back or youthful face could mean a higher value. Mothers were torn from their children. Husbands watched their wives dragged away, unable to speak, unable to fight. Further east, the trade spread to Hedeby in Denmark and Birka in Sweden, both thriving ports built on human misery. From these markets, captives were shipped even farther, across frozen rivers and dense forests, along the Volga trade route that connected the Viking world to the riches of the East. Arab merchants came to buy, their silver coins glittering in the hands of Norse traders. One of them, Ahmad ibn Fadlan, saw this world with his own eyes. He wrote of Norsemen displaying their captives like livestock, even violating women in front of potential buyers to prove their control. It was not a story meant to shock. It was simply how business was done. The trade was vast and organized. Captives taken from an English village could be sold in Dublin, shipped to Birka, and then carried down the Volga to be sold again in the markets of Constantinople or Baghdad. Every transaction left another scar across continents. Archaeologists have uncovered thousands of Arabic silver coins buried in Scandinavia, proof of the wealth this cruel system produced. Each coin was a piece of evidence, silent, cold, and undeniable. What began as a single raid on a small village had become a machine, stretching from the icy north to the deserts of the east. And, at the heart of it all, were the nameless, women whose lives had become the foundation of this global trade life. For the enslaved was a slow death stretched over years. Once sold, a woman became property, stripped of her name, her family, and her identity. In the Norse world, she was called a thrall, a word that meant both servant and possession. The old laws of Iceland and Norway spoke of thralls not as people but as objects, listed beside livestock and tools. A thrall had no rights. Her master could beat her, starve her, or even kill her without punishment. Her voice had no weight in court. Her children, if she had any, were born into the same chains that bound her. It was a life without escape, a life designed to break the spirit. Each day began before the sun rose. The thrall worked while others slept, tending fires, hauling water, and grinding grain until her arms ached. The sound of the hand mill was endless, a dull rhythm that filled the longhouse from dawn until night. Her hands cracked from cold water, her back bent from carrying heavy loads. She cooked, cleaned, wove cloth, and brewed ale, all without rest. The coarse woolen fabric called vadmal, used for clothing and trade, was made through her endless labor. Every thread she spun added to her master's wealth, but not to her freedom. Archaeology reveals the cost of this life. The bones of those believed to be thralls show signs of hard labor, worn joints, broken spines, and teeth ground down from years of grinding grain. Their graves were small and poor, marked with little more than earth. The sagas describe them as having rough hands and bent fingers, and the soil confirms it. Their diets were worse than those of free people, and their bodies carried the marks of exhaustion. There was no rest, no safety, and no hope. A free woman in Norse society was protected by honor and law. A thrall was protected by nothing. Her world was a circle of endless work, hunger, and silence. She existed in the shadows of the longhouse, unseen and unnamed, a living tool in a world that had decided she was worth less than the things she made. For many enslaved women, the suffering did not end with labor. Their bodies were also treated as property, part of the wealth their masters owned. In Norse society, a slave woman could be used at any time, for any purpose, and it was not considered a crime. There was no word for violation when ownership was the law. These women became concubines, known in Old Norse as frill, a term that meant companion, but truly meant captive. They lived under the same roof as the free wife, serving her by day and the master by night. It was a life of constant humiliation, without consent, without peace, and without an end. The sagas, though written centuries later, reflect this harsh truth. They often describe powerful men taking women from foreign lands as frills, their beauty admired, but their will ignored. One story tells of Melkorka, an Irish princess captured in a raid and sold in Norway. Her tongue was said to have been cut so she could not speak her true name. She was bought by an Icelandic chieftain and bore him a son, but she remained a slave until the end of her days. Her story, like many others, was softened in the retelling, turned into legend to hide the pain that lay beneath. Children born from these forced unions were called frillborn, the offspring of a concubine. Their place in society was uncertain. Some were recognized by their fathers and given freedom, while others were denied and left to live as slaves. Their blood carried both privilege and shame. This system created a silent divide inside every longhouse, between the free wife and the enslaved mother, between the heir and the child who could never inherit. Modern science now confirms what the old stories only whispered. Genetic studies from Iceland show that while most of the male settlers were Norse, the majority of the women came from Gaelic lands, Ireland and Scotland. Over 60% of Icelandic maternal DNA traces back to those regions. These women were not settlers by choice. They were captives carried across the sea, taken in raids, and forced into a new life. Their children became the founders of a nation, their bloodline woven into the fabric of Iceland's history. The sagas speak of heroes and kings, but the truth lies in the bones and in the DNA, that the North was not only built by conquerors, but also by the stolen and the silenced. Not every captive woman was destined for labor or concubinage. Some were too valuable to sell, their names and titles worth more than silver. Noble women, queens, and daughters of kings were taken as hostages, used as tools for ransom and power. The Vikings understood their worth well. These captives were bargaining chips in the high-stakes game of politics. A single noble prisoner could buy peace, land, or wealth beyond measure. Yet even for them, safety was uncertain. Their fates depended on the greed or mercy of their captors. They lived in fear, knowing their lives could be traded away or ended at any moment. But for others, death came not as escape, but as ritual. Among the Vikings, the line between devotion and cruelty often blurred. Some captives, especially enslaved, women were chosen for sacrifice, offerings meant to serve their masters in the afterlife. The most chilling account of this comes from Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who traveled among the Rus, the Norse traders of the East, in the year 922. He witnessed the funeral of a great chieftain, and what he described remains one of the most disturbing stories in history. According to Ibn Fadlan, when the chieftain died, one of his female slaves was chosen to follow him in death. She was said to have volunteered, but there was no real choice. Over several days she was dressed in fine clothes, given wine until she could no longer stand, and made to sing sad songs as she was passed from tent to tent. Each man lay with her, claiming it was a gesture of honor for their fallen leader. On the final day, she was taken to the ship where her master's body lay. There, an old woman known as the Angel of Death placed a rope around her neck. As two men pulled it tight, the woman stabbed her again and again. Her screams were drowned by the sound of warriors beating their shields. When it was over, the ship was set on fire, carrying both bodies to the next world in a storm of smoke and flame. This account was not a fantasy. Archaeological finds have revealed graves that confirm such practices. In Norway and Sweden, burials have been uncovered where more than one body lies in a single grave. One high-ranking figure, and others clearly servants or slaves. At the famous Oseberg burial, two women were found together, one older and of noble birth, the other younger and frail. Many scholars believe she was sacrificed to accompany her mistress. Even in death, captivity did not end. It became sacred theater, a final act of ownership performed in blood. For the enslaved, there was no freedom in life and no peace in death. In the Viking world, slavery was not seen as evil. It was normal, accepted, and deeply woven into daily life. To own thralls was a mark of power and success. A wealthy man was judged not only by his silver or land, but by the number of people he controlled. In their eyes, this was the natural order. Some were born to rule and others were born to serve. The Sagas, the great stories of their age, rarely questioned it. They spoke proudly of warriors, kings, and explorers, but they almost never mentioned the countless thralls who built their ships, cooked their food, and raised their children. Their silence was not cruelty, but something worse, indifference. The suffering of the enslaved had become invisible, buried under the pride of conquest. The Norse legal codes reflected the same truth. A thrall's life had no legal value. If killed, there was no fine, no punishment, no guilt. Their word meant nothing in court. Their marriage had no meaning, and their children were born as property. Yet sometimes a small spark of humanity broke through the darkness. A master could free a thrall, a rare act called manumission. Some did it as a reward for loyal service, others as a gesture of faith before death. One runestone in Denmark tells of a blacksmith named Toke, who raised a stone in memory of his master, the man who gave him both gold and freedom. These stories are rare, but they remind us that even in an age built on cruelty, mercy could still exist, though it was the exception, not the rule. As centuries passed, slavery began to fade, but not because of sudden compassion. It changed shape. The rise of Christianity made it harder to enslave fellow believers, yet the system only shifted. New victims replaced the old ones. The mindset that allowed one human to own another did not vanish overnight. It simply found new forms. This is the most haunting truth of all. The true horror wasn't the violence, but how normal it became. A society that built ships, wrote poetry, and carved runes also built its greatness on chains. Their songs remembered the glory, but their silence preserved the guilt. And beneath the myths and the legends, the real story of the Viking Age still whispers, not of courage or discovery, but of the lives that were taken to make it all possible. When we look back at the Viking Age, we often see the shining image, brave explorers, daring warriors, and master shipbuilders who crossed oceans and discovered new worlds. But behind that image stands another truth, one we cannot ignore. Their greatness was built on the suffering of others. The silver in their halls came from human misery. The sails that carried them across the seas were made by hands bound in chains. Every story of glory hides another story of pain. The captives, the thralls, the silenced, they too are part of this history. They are the missing half of the Viking world, and their voices deserve to be heard. To remember history honestly is not to destroy its legacy, but to complete it. We cannot separate the hero from the harm, or the progress from the pain. The Viking Age was not just an age of discovery, but an age of domination, where people became property and power grew from the lives of the powerless. This truth is not meant to shame, but to remind us. Every civilization, even the most admired, carries shadows within its triumphs. To forget those shadows is to repeat them. When we remember the Viking Age, we must remember it whole, the builders and the broken, the conquerors and the conquered. The sagas tell of men who shaped the world with courage and fire, but the untold stories, of women taken, of lives lost, of freedom stolen, shaped it just as deeply. Their pain built empires. Their silence filled the gaps between the lines of history. And so, When we speak of the Vikings, let us also speak of those they left behind, because their story is not just the darkness of the past, it is the mirror of our humanity. If you value stories that uncover the forgotten, subscribe. It helps us bring lost voices back to light and keeps history honest and alive. Every click, every comment, and every share helps us continue telling the stories that the old chronicles chose to forget. The past is not just made of kings and warriors, but also of those who suffered in silence. And through remembering them, we make history whole again. Tell us, from where in the world are you watching this story? Because no matter where you are, these voices from 1,000 years ago still reach us, asking to be heard, reminding us that behind every legend, there is a human truth waiting to be seen.